हेलो एंड वेलकम टू अनदर एपिसोड ऑफ नाजुक मोड। मैं हूं उजैर यूनुस और आज क्वेटा से हमें ज्वाइन कर रही हैं अंबरन शमसी। लेकिन क्वेटा में हवाएं क्या चल रही हैं वो अभी तक उनको महसूस नहीं हुआ है। उनका जो वेदर स्टेशन है वो अभी डिप्लॉय पूरा तरह नहीं हुआ है, तो अगले हफ्ते वी विल गेट अपडेट्स फ्रॉम क्वेटा। बट इस शो पे हम बात करेंगे पाकिस्तान की सियासत में एक नया सेटअप जो है हमें नजर आ रहा है। नेक्स्ट सीजन सोप ऑपरा का, उसकी कहानी क्या होगी, उसका प्लॉट लाइन क्या होगा।
क्योंकि उजैर जो है ना वो बहुत आगे की सोचते हैं, ये मैं बता दूं।
आगे
हम जो
जी।
सहाफी होते हैं ना, हम सहाफी होते हैं, हम हफ्ते 2 दिन, कुछ हद तक चले 2 हफ्ते तक हम सोच लेंगे। लेकिन उजैर जो है ना, ही इज वॉर गेम
वो
इन द
प्लॉट
नेक्स्ट
लाइन
सीजन
आगे की
ऑलरेडी।
होनी चाहिए ना, फिर उसके
बिल्कुल
हिसाब से
बिल्कुल।
साफियों को कवर करना चाहिए कि प्लॉट लाइन है क्या। तो उस पे करेंगे। सुप्रीम कोर्ट में जो है हलचल मची हुई है, हमने पिछले हफ्ते भी इस पे बात की थी। वी विल हैव सम क्विक अपडेट्स ऑन दैट। और हम फिर एक स्पेशल इंटरव्यू है अकबर का। ही इज अ फ्रेंड ऑफ माइन एट हफिंगटन पोस्ट। उन्होंने एक सीरीज ऑफ आर्टिकल्स लिखे हैं ऑन द इजराइल पैलेस्टाइन कॉन्फ्लिक्ट जो कि अभी चल रहा है, बट फ्रॉम अ इम्पैक्ट ऑन यूएस पॉलिटिक्स एंड यूएस इंस्टीट्यूशंस के। स्टेट डिपार्टमेंट में क्या हो रहा है, व्हाइट हाउस के अंदर क्या इसके ऊपर बात हो रही है। तो अकबर से बात करेंगे एंड देन आई विल आल्सो शेयर सम ऑफ माय ओन व्यूज ऑन व्हाट्स गोइंग ऑन इन वाशिंगटन एंड अंबर विल हैव अ पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू ऑन दिस एज वेल। एंड देन ऑफ कोर्स विनर्स एंड लूजर्स। विनर्स बड़े कम हैं, लूजर्स इस हफ्ते ज्यादा हैं। पहले से ही आपको वार्न कर देते हैं कि ये गम आवर टाइप एपिसोड है एक तरह से। हम तो शुरू करते हैं। अंबर, जरा बताएं कि क्या पीटीआई अचानक से पीपल्स पार्टी की तारीफ करने लग गई है। पीटीआई के लीडर असद कैसर साहब, इंक्लूडिंग फॉर्मर स्पीकर ऑफ द पार्लियामेंट नेशनल असेंबली, उन्होंने मौलाना साहब के पीछे नमाज तक पढ़ ली। क्या क्या प्लॉट लाइन इमर्ज हो रही है 2024 के सीजन की।
ठीक है। अब जस्ट क्विकली बैकग्राउंड ऑन दिस, आई थिंक इट्स रियली इंपॉर्टेंट टू थिंक अबाउट द ऑप्टिक्स ऑफ नवाज शरीफ रिटर्न। और जो उनको नैब की तरफ से उनके जो भी केसेस हैं जहां वो जमानत मांगते हैं या अपील के हवाले से जब वो दरखास्त दायर करते हैं, तो कहीं से कोई एतराज नहीं आता। और ये जैसे हम बार बार कह चुके हैं कि जब पॉलिटिकल इंजीनियरिंग होती है तो नैब बहुत एतराज करता है। इस बार जीरो जीरो एतराज। And the politics of this momentum gaining, गैलप का सर्वे भी आया था, I think 1,000 people positive sentiment for Nawaz Sharif. So there's obviously you can see what's usually called narrative building, right? Of success के हवा का रुख। मैं क्वेटा में जो हवा का रुख है इस वक्त, तो जाहिर है थोड़ा सा चिली है। लेकिन नवाज शरीफ के लिए तो सियासी गर्मा गर्मी है। और
वो
ये
मफलर लेके आए हैं अपने साथ अंबर, वो मफलर पहना हुआ होता है उन्होंने।
बिल्कुल बिल्कुल। और वो जाहिर है अमन के जो कबूतर है वो भी उड़ा रहे होते हैं। बट एनीवे, so the point is that what this optics has done, and for good reason. बाकी जो मेन स्ट्रीम जमातें जिनको बहुत उम्मीद थी कि वो पीटीएम की हुकूमत में शामिल होंगे, बॉयज के साथ भी करीब होंगे, अपनी सीरीज भी पेश करेंगे, उनको भी कुछ मौके मिलेंगे, उनके जो कुछ ख्वाब है वो भी चिकनाचूर हो गए हैं। क्योंकि साफ जाहिर था कि पाकिस्तान पीपल्स पार्टी, क्योंकि वो पंजाब में उनकी ज्यादा वो सीटें तो हासिल नहीं कर सकते, अ, उनके लिए अगली पावर सेटअप में क्या रोल होगा वो मुश्किल भी लग रहा है और लिमिटेड भी लग रहा है, महदूद लग रहा है। जेयूआईफे उन इलाकों में वो ऑपरेट करते हैं, मिसाल के खास तौर पे मैं कहूंगी खैबर पख्तूनख्वा में, जहां उनका मुकाबला पाकिस्तान तहरीक इंसाफ के साथ रहा है। और पाकिस्तान तहरीक इंसाफ और जेयूआईफे का एक आइडियोलॉजिकल मुकाबला भी है, इसलिए क्योंकि खास तौर पे कहूंगी खैबर पख्तूनख्वा में जहाँ एक कंजर्वेटिव एलिमेंट है, वो यू हैव अलायंसेस लाइक द एमएमए। और 2013 के इंतखाबात में जमात इस्लामी और पाकिस्तान तहरीक इंसाफ का इत्तेहाद भी था। सो यू सी एन आइडियोलॉजिकल राइट लीनिंग अलायंस एज वेल। तो इनका एक वोटर के हवाले से ये भी एक मुकाबला है। मगर कहानी में ट्विस्ट आई इस दफा, इसलिए क्योंकि एक मफाहमती ग्रुप है पाकिस्तान तहरीक इंसाफ में, और उसका जो लीड है जो अभी तक मौजूद है उसमें असद कैसर, अली मोहम्मद, जो बहुत मशहूर हुए थे जब वोट ऑफ नो कॉन्फिडेंस हुआ था। वो आखिरी पाकिस्तान तहरीक इंसाफ लास्ट मैन स्टैंडिंग बैठे रहे थे असेंबली में, बाकी सब ने वॉकआउट कर ली। दूसरी तरफ हमें मालूम है कि जो आला क़यादत है या तो छोड़ चुकी है या जेल में है। शाह महमूद कुरैशी, जो उनको बहुत कहा जाता है कि बहुत उम्मीद थी कि वो नेक्स्ट इन लाइन होंगे, एयर टू द थ्रोन होंगे। साइफर केस में वो मुश्किल में घिरे हुए हैं इमरान खान साहब के साथ। बट एक मफाहमती ग्रुप है एक तरफ आपको बार बार मुतहरक आपको नजर आ रहे थे मोहम्मद अली दुरानी, फॉर्मर सेनेटर पाकिस्तान मुस्लिम काफ, अगेन वेरी क्लोज टू द एस्टैब्लिशमेंट, जिनकी हर तरफ से मुलाकातें हुई थी. सो आई थिंक द बिग इमेज फ्रॉम दिस वीक आई थिंक वाज ऑब्वियसली जिस तरीके से मौलाना फजल रहमान के साथ मुलाकात हुई, जो पाकिस्तान तहरीक इंसाफ के वफामती ग्रुप है, जो आपको फिर भी टेलीविजन पे नजर आ रहे हैं, जिन्होंने अलहदगी इख्तियार नहीं की, जिन्होंने प्रेस कॉन्फ्रेंस नहीं की, जो जेलों से भी रिलीज हो गए, अली मोहम्मद के हवाले से मैं बात कर रही हूँ, और उनके मौलाना के पीछे वो ज़ाहिर नमाज भी अदा कर रहे थे, जो पाकिस्तान तहरीक इंसाफ की तरफ से काफी जो सपोर्टर है, बहुत बहुत तनकीद भी हुई इसलिए, क्योंकि ये जो राइवलरी है फॉर वोट बैंक्स इन केपी, आपको उसका आकाश कैसे नजर आती है. एक तरफ अगर इमरान खान तज़हीक का में डीजल डीजल कहते हैं, तो दूसरी तरफ मौलाना थकते नहीं हैं अब हमें बताते हुए कि ये इमरान खान यहूदी साजिश के तहत हम पे मुसल्लत किए गए हैं. सो दैट राइवलरी इज डर्टी एंड इट्स सिग्निफिकेंट, एंड येट वी सी देयर फोर्सेस अलाइन, एंड द फोर्सेस आर अलाइनिंग क्योंकि उन सबको नजर आ रहा है कि एक सियासी जमात है जिसका पंजाब में वोट बैंक है, उनके लिए रास्ते खुले जा रहे हैं, खुले जा रहे हैं, उनके लिए आसानियां पैदा की जा रही हैं. और ये जो बाकी जमातें हैं, और अब क्योंकि अब हमें देख रहे हैं आरिफ अलवी साहब, सदर आरिफ अलवी साहब, जिन्होंने हामिद मीर साहब को एक इंटरव्यू दिया था, उन्होंने भी बहुत तारीफ की पाकिस्तान पीपल्स पार्टी की, क्योंकि पाकिस्तान पीपल्स पार्टी बार बार तो यही कह रही है कि इलेक्शंस भी वक्त पे होने चाहिए. इसके बावजूद मैं कहूंगी कि काउंसिल ऑफ कॉमन इंटरेस्ट में उन्होंने अपना चीफ मिनिस्टर भी भेजा था और हामी भी भरी थी. बट लेट्स पुट दैट असाइड फॉर अ मोमेंट. बिलावल भुट्टो जरदारी खास तौर पे बार बार कह रहे हैं कि इंतखाबात, ऐसे इंतखाबात जहां आपको एक और सियासी जमात को की गैर हाजिरी मौजूदगी उनके लिए मुश्किलात होगी, तो वो फ्री एंड फेयर इलेक्शन नहीं होगा. एंड इट डजंट रिजॉल्व द इश्यूज ऑफ द 2018 इलेक्शन, जहां आपका एक पावर बैलेंस भी नजर आया, उसके नतीजे में जो कॉन्फ्लिक्ट था, it led up to especially I think the events of last year and the constant political uncertainty of the last 4 or 5 years. So that is Pakistan People's Party's perspective. और पाकिस्तान तहरीक इंसाफ ने हमें जो सिर्फ आरिफ अलवी साहब ने इंडिया नहीं दिया, पाकिस्तान तहरीक इंसाफ के ऑफिशियल स्टेटमेंट भी है कि वो चाहते हैं कि वो सियासी जमातों के साथ बातचीत करें, मफाहमत करें और कुछ मामला हल करें. और आपको एक जैसे पीडीएम का एक इत्तेहाद बना था इमरान खान और द ब्लू आइड बॉय एट दैट टाइम ऑफ द एस्टैब्लिशमेंट, अब पाकिस्तान मुस्लिम लीग नवाज और पाकिस्तान और नवाज शरीफ के खिलाफ भी एटलीस्ट सम काइंड ऑफ अलायंस आपको बनती हुई नजर आ रही है. आई विल वांट टू पॉइंट आउट बिफोर आई हैंड इट बैक ओवर टू यू ज़ैर, इज दैट वी मस्ट ऑल्सो रिमेम्बर कि इमरान खान साहब बातचीत से हमेशा खास तौर पर सियासी जमातों के साथ कुछ उनको कुछ मसला जरूर रहा है. बिकॉज वी हैव टू रिमेम्बर कि जब ये 9 मई से कबल जब दोनों वफूद थे पाकिस्तान तहरीक इंसाफ के और पाकिस्तान डेमोक्रेटिक मूवमेंट के, इलेक्शंस की तारीख उनको दे रहे थे हैंडिंग ओवर ऑन अ प्लेटर, क्योंकि जो पीडीएम की जमातें थी उनका यही ख्याल था कि इस वक्त हम इख्तिदार में हैं, हम इलेक्शंस करवा सकते हैं, यही वक्त है, कर लो, मान लो. नहीं मान रहे थे. इससे पहले भी बार बार जब भी बातचीत करनी चाहिए थी या मौका मिला था, तो इमरान खान साहब हमेशा तरजीह दी थी कि वो फौज से बातचीत करें, मफाहमत करें. लेकिन इस वक्त फौज जाहिर है अपने दरवाजे तो काफी बंद किए हुए हैं, वेरी क्लियर ऑन how they see the elections and where they see Imran Khan in the elections, which is nowhere in jail really. So that's sort of the big sort of takeaway from this week and going
Thank
forward next week as well.
थैंक यू अंबर फॉर दैट ओवरव्यू. और ये जो इजलास हुई थी उसकी मैं स्टेटमेंट भी पढ़ देता हूँ, एक लाइन फॉर द ऑडियंस. कोट एंड कोट, पीपल्स पार्टी की एक जिम्मेदार शख्सियत की जानिब से तहरीक इंसाफ की शमूलियत के बगैर इंतखाबात को तस्लीम ना करने का बयान दुरुस्त सोच की आकासी है का आकाश है. सियासी कमेटी तहरीक इंसाफ, एंड कोट. तो बिलावल भुट्टो साहब का उन्होंने नाम तो नहीं लिया,
हाँ, वो
और
एक्नॉलेज नहीं कर सकते क्योंकि
एक्नॉलेज
जैसे
तक
डीजल
अभी तक
डीजल
बात
कह
नहीं
सकते.
पहुंची है जी. अभी तक वो
हाँ,
बात
वहां तक नहीं
अभी तक
पहुंची.
नहीं पहुंची है. पहुंच जाएगी थोड़े
But
टाइम में, मुझे लगता है.
मगर I think the People's Party has also been playing the game because उनके दो ऐसे वुकला है जो रिप्रेजेंट कर रहे हैं इमरान खान साहब को और उनके एहलिया को, लतीफ खोसा और एतजाज एहसन.
जी. तो अब इसके अंदर देखिए, मैं तो जब ये तस्वीर देखी और ये स्टेटमेंट भी पढ़ी और जरदा बिलावल साहब की भी स्टेटमेंट्स पढ़ी खबरों में, तो मुझे यही याद आया कि इतने सारे दोस्त हैं, जानने वाले हैं मेरे, जो एक दूसरे से लड़ झगड़ के कहते हैं हम तुमसे बात नहीं करेंगे क्योंकि तुम जियाले हो, तुम पटवारी हो, तुम यूथिए हो, तुम कुछ और हो, ठीक है ना। तो उनको मैंने एक ही मैसेज भेजा, मैंने कहा भाई देख लें, आप आपस में आपने अपनी रिश्तेदारियां दोस्तियां खराब की इस लड़ाई में, और अब देख लेंगे कहाँ जा रही है लड़ाई, राइट। तो वो जो
Yeah.
सियासत में मुक मुक्का होता है, इट्स आई व्यू इट ऑलवेज एज अ गुड थिंग, कॉम्प्रोमाइज होना चाहिए, इंटरेस्ट इवॉल्व होते हैं सियासी पार्टियों के। लेकिन अब ये जो आपने जैसे कहा कि जो प्लॉट लाइन इमर्ज हो रही है अगले सीजन का सेटअप जो है, वो यही है कि एक तरफ नून लीग इस्टेब्लिशमेंट के साथ होगी, हाफिज साहब के साथ, और दूसरी तरफ बाकी खड़े होंगे, ठीक है ना। और सबको अब इंतजार होगा कि हाफिज साहब और मियाँ साहब की लड़ाई जो है वो एक्सटेंशन से पहले होती है या एक्सटेंशन के वक्त होती है या किसी और पॉलिसी इशू पे होती है। तो फिर हमारा दरवाजा जो है वो क्वेटा की हवाओं का रुख थोड़ा गर्मी की तरफ जाएगा, तो हमारा मौका बनेगा। तो यही कहानी चल रही है पाकिस्तान की सियासत में, प्लॉट लाइन जो है वो अगली यही नजर
वही
आ
मसला है
रही
कि
है।
तोड़ नहीं है ना, क्योंकि again the power center is still the establishment, and I think it's obviously gotten much stronger in this vacuum that's been created post 9th May. And
बिल्कुल
that is actually what I think ought to happen if political parties come together. इसलिए नहीं क्योंकि वो इमरान खान के खिलाफ वो जिहाद कर रहे हैं या नवाज शरीफ के खिलाफ जिहाद कर रहे हैं. It is actually breaking the cycle on dependency. And I unfortunately I really don't see that happening. It's a
करेक्ट।
narrow political interest है.
तो थोड़ी सी चेंज जो है अंबर इंस्टीट्यूशनली वो अब नजर आ रही है सुप्रीम कोर्ट के अंदर। तो अब वहाँ इस हफ्ते की खबर जो दो बड़ी मुझे नजर आई वो ये कि नैब की जो अमेंडमेंट स्ट्राइक डाउन हुई थी उसकी अपील सुनी जाएगी 31 तारीख को गालिबन। और 5 मेंबर बेंच है जजेस की, इंक्लूडिंग जस्टिस चीफ जस्टिस ऑफ पाकिस्तान। और उसके साथ साथ जो है उन्होंने सुप्रीम जुडिशल काउंसिल में जस्टिस नकवी के ऊपर जो इल्जामात हैं उसके ऊपर भी प्रोसीडिंग्स, लगता है कि 3-2 का वोट था कि आगे बढ़ें। तो उस पर अपडेट दें जरा, क्या सुप्रीम कोर्ट में भी जो है एक अलग खिचड़ी पक रही है और जस्टिस ईसा इज ट्राइंग टू बेसिकली, आई वुड से, एटलीस्ट दिस इज माय व्यू, क्लीन अप शॉप आफ्टर जस्टिस बंदयाल्स टेन्योर।
यस, और वो जाहिर है हमें फुल कोर्ट जब प्रैक्टिस एंड प्रोसीजर बिल है, आई थिंक दैट वाज द फर्स्ट स्टेप एंड अ वेरी पॉजिटिव स्टेप. मज़ाहिर अली नकवी के खिलाफ उनकी ऑडियो लीक्स भी आए, उनके खिलाफ करप्शन के भी इल्जामात हैं. There were calls within the Supreme Court benches, bench यानी कि सुप्रीम कोर्ट के जो जजेस हैं, कि इन्वेस्टिगेशन जरूर होनी चाहिए. And I think that is where that obviously is heading. It's an important distinction because I think जो एक बहुत वाज़े तौर पर आपको नजर आता है कि काजी फाइज ईसा के खिलाफ तो फटाफट रेफरेंस जो है वो आगे जुडिशल काउंसिल के सामने पेश हो गया
और
था.
जस्टिस नकवी
लेकिन
जरा इसमें पर्सनल भी हुए थे जस्टिस साहब के साथ
यस,
उस जमाने में।
यस, यस, एग्जैक्टली. और दूसरी तरफ आपको नजर आया कि जब मज़ाहिर अली नकवी विद इन सुप्रीम कोर्ट, यही समझा जा रहा था कि फिर उनके भी बारे में कोई जाहिर है हियरिंग तो होनी चाहिए, आगे बढ़ना चाहिए. तो वो नहीं हो पाई थी. आई मीन, obviously the benches are obviously somewhat divided. I think it's एक अच्छा एग्जांपल जो आपको नजर भी आया था, whatever the law says is, ये मिलिट्री कोर्ट्स के हवाले से जो एक जजमेंट भी आई थी, इसमें majority judgment कुछ एक एतराज था, लेकिन फिर भी was against trying civilians in military courts. और I think the interesting thing now is next obviously NAB कि जो स्ट्राइक डाउन किया था उमर अता बंदयाल साहब ने, साबिक चीफ जस्टिस ने, उसमें भी अपील अकॉर्डिंग टू दैट स्पेशल जो प्रोसीजर एक्ट है, अपील दायर हुई है. वो भी बेंच, लार्जर बेंच है. So lots of interesting things to happen. I do want to point out an interesting thing that somebody raised. हमने बहुत तारीफ की, and I don't want to talk too much in detail about the military courts and उसका क्या नतीजा होगा. बहुत अच्छी बात है, precedent भी set होगा. But one of my fears here is, again, because the military has obviously gained power in this particular vacuum of political forces. One of the fears right now is कि जब पार्लियामेंट नहीं आएगी, तो फिर दोबारा से कानून साजी होगी ताकि सिविलियंस को मिलिट्री कोर्ट्स में ट्राई किया जाए. And the argument is कि अगर मिलिट्री इंस्टॉलेशंस पर अटैक्स होते हैं, हमले होते हैं, तो फिर कौन सी अदालत होनी चाहिए? जिसपे मेरा आर्ग्यूमेंट तो यही है कि इंसदाद दहशतगर्दी की अदालतें हैं, इसीलिए हैं. Is it very different from other high value targets such as the stock exchange, for instance? It is actually of as much strategic importance as well. So that's sort of the fear at the moment.
That's a good point, Amber, because it reminded me. I'm almost
Mm,
done. I've finally got
mm,
around to reading Maulana Azad's India Wins Freedom. तो उस
mm,
पे शुरुआत के चैप्टर्स में जब मौलाना साहब अपने हिस्ट्री तारीख बयान करते हैं, तो ऑब्वियसली उनको भी अरेस्ट किया गया था. आई थिंक वो एक दफ़ा किताब में लिखते हैं, आई माइट बी गेटिंग द एग्जैक्ट नंबर्स रॉन्ग, कि उनका वजन जो है जेल में अर्ली 40s में जब
mm,
उन्हें डाला गया, कोई 30-40 पाउंड कम हुआ था जेल में जब उनको
mm,
डाला गया था. लेकिन जब मैं उनके बयानात पढ़ता हूँ, और इनफैक्ट मौलाना आज़ाद की आई थिंक जो बेगम थी उनका भी इंतकाल जब वो जेल में थे हुआ, और उनको इजाज़त नहीं दी गई थी बात करने की आखिरी वक्त पे. अम, लेकिन उसमें जब मैं बयान का पढ़ता हूँ कि अंग्रेज़ों कॉलोनियल एम्पायर से जिसने उन्हें अरेस्ट किया था और बाकी और लीडर्स को, फ्रीडम फाइटर्स को अरेस्ट किया हुआ था, जेल में डाला हुआ था, कि जो ट्रीटमेंट दी जाती थी, आई वाज रीडिंग दैट एंड आई वाज कंपेयरिंग कि यार एक कॉलोनियल एम्पायर की ट्रीटमेंट इन मेनी इंस्टेंसेस टू सिविलियंस रिबेलिंग अगेंस्ट
mm,
एम्पायर एसेंशियली वाज मच
mm,
बेटर देन व्हाट वी आर सीइंग टुडे. के मिलिट्री कोड, जैसे आपने कहा भाई, अगर अटैक किया है आपने, तो सिविलियन कानून पीनल कोड में या एंटी टेरर कोड के अंदर
mm,
उसके कवानीन मौजूद है. मैं तो समझता हूँ एटीसी में भी नहीं जाना चाहिए, रेगुलर कोड में कवानीन मौजूद हैं. आपके पास एविडेंस है तो आप ट्राई करें. और ये आर्ग्यूमेंट के जी स्पीडी ट्रायल होना चाहिए, तो भाई ट्रायल स्पीडी नहीं होना चाहिए, ट्रायल होना चाहिए सबूत और एविडेंस के साथ और आर्ग्यूमेंट के साथ. और अगर आपने प्रूव कर सकते हैं बियॉन्ड रीजनेबल डाउट, अगेन पीपल फॉरगेट इन द पाकिस्तानी कॉन्टेक्स्ट कि काम प्रोसिक्यूशन का है टू प्रूव बियॉन्ड रीजनेबल डाउट कि किसी ने कुछ
and it
क्राइम
and
किया है.
it's and we keep forgetting due process अगर नहीं होता तो फिर उसका फायदा भी नहीं होता. It backfires, right?
बिल्कुल.
Which is के एक इल्जामात लगते हैं कि आपने सियासी इंजीनियरिंग की है, या अनफेयरली किसी को फिर हिरासत में रखा जाता है और उनके खिलाफ सजा भी होती है. So that's why due process is important. That's why transparency is important. बस जल्दी कर दो, लटका दो. That's it.
या
That's how
प्रेस
we think.
कॉन्फ्रेंस करा दो तो गुनाह माफ हो जाएंगे. आपने जो है वो
Yeah.
गुस्ल ले लिया है प्रेस कॉन्फ्रेंस का.
बिल्कुल बिल्कुल.
तो
Andalib Abbas incidentally is one example, allegedly with Khadija Shah, who was still in jail, but Andalib Abbas ने इस्तेकाम पाकिस्तान पार्टी जिसने कभी जलसा भी किया है छोटा मोटा, वो उनको तो ज्वाइन कर लिया, तो वो भी ड्राई क्लीन हो गई.
या और खतीजा का देखें कि बेल का ऑर्डर आ गया था और उसके बावजूद जो है वो नहीं छोड़ा जा रहा. और मतलब इट्स रिडिकुलस व्हाट्स हैपनिंग कि आप कोर्ट का ऑर्डर है लेकिन नया चार्ज, नया कोई ड्रामा चला के जेल में ही रखा जा रहा है, व्हिच इज नॉट हाउ इट शुड बी डन. बट we'll keep following this as well. आगे बढ़ते हैं अंबर. Obviously, last week we did not talk about the Israel-Palestine conflict. Since then,
हम्म,
Israel has more heavily bombarded Gaza. ग्राउंड incursions भी शुरू हो गई हैं. बट एक इस कॉन्वर्जेशन में जो है ऑब्वियसली यूएन में सीज फायर की रेजोल्यूशन मूव हुई. उस पे जॉर्डन वाज वन ऑफ द को स्पॉन्सर्स, एज वाज पाकिस्तान. कनाडा एंड द यूनाइटेड स्टेट्स ट्राइड टू मूव एन अमेंडमेंट, जो कि 2/3 मेजोरिटी आपको यूएन में चाहिए होती है टू मूव एन अमेंडमेंट. वो सक्सीड नहीं हुई. एंड पाकिस्तान एम्बेसडर टू द यूएन, एम्बेसडर मुनीर, gave a very good speech. He got an
yeah.
ovation. I think people should watch that speech because he
हम्म,
really breaks down the core issue around at least the resolution. And again, I think ये चीज़ें ज़रूरी हैं लोगों को समझना कि चाहे यूएन हो, चाहे ग्लोबल कैपिटल्स हो, मीडिया के अंदर हो, द आर्ग्यूमेंट जिस पे आप बहस को छेड़ते हैं या डिबेट करते हैं, वो किस तरह आप कंडक्ट करते हैं. तो मुनीर साहब की जो मुझे दो चीज़ें बड़ी अच्छी लगी अंबर, इन टर्म्स ऑफ हाउ ही फ्रेम्ड द आर्ग्यूमेंट एंड डिसएम्पावर्ड द पोजीशन कैनेडा फॉर एग्जांपल वाज टेकिंग, वाज कि पहला उन्होंने कहा कि अगर आप नाम से हमास को कंडेम करना चाहते हैं और नाम से कहना चाहते हैं कि वो हॉस्टेजेस रिलीज करें, तो फिर हम भी मूव करेंगे अमेंडमेंट के नाम लेके फिर हम इसराइल को भी कंडेम करें, और नाम लेके हम भी कहें कि इसराइलियों ने जो हॉस्टेजेस लिए हुए हैं, जिनमें खवातीन और बच्चे भी शामिल हैं, एडमिनिस्ट्रेटिव डिटेंशन उसे कहा जाता है, तो फिर हम वो भी मूव करेंगे. कि ये नहीं हो सकता कि आप एक पार्टी का नाम लें और दूसरी का ना लें. और उन्होंने कहा कि हमारी जो ओरिजिनल रेजोल्यूशन है उसकी जबान में नाम हमने नहीं लिए किसी के, हमने अक्रॉस द लाइन कहा है कि ये चीजें रोकें, ह्यूमैनिटेरियन असिस्टेंस आने दें और हॉस्टेजेस को रिलीज किया जाए। तो ये एक बड़ी अच्छी उन्होंने पोजीशन ली। दूसरी जो उन्होंने ली वो इस बहस के अंदर, क्योंकि ऑब्वियसली Western media has been using passive language around this conflict. Palestinians die, Israelis are killed, all of that stuff we've seen and critiqued on social media and other platforms as well. उन्होंने जो अच्छी बात की, he used tort law to make an argument about what is the cause of this current conflict or this current wave of conflict or war, however you may want to call it, because I know people disagree on how to even call it what it is. I believe it's asymmetric war, but whatever. उन्होंने कहा कि जो हमास का टेरर अटैक है वो प्रॉक्सिमेट कॉज है करंट क्राइसिस की, लेकिन जो ओरिजिनल सिन है वो ऑक्यूपेशन है, वो 1948 का नकबा है, वो not giving the Palestinians the state that the UN has supported that they ought to have. तो उन्होंने अगेन लोग, क्योंकि मेन स्ट्रीम स्पेशली पाकिस्तान की कॉन्वर्जेशन में इतना बारीकियों में लोग नहीं जाते कि क्यों उन्होंने एक स्पेसिफिक जबान इस्तेमाल की। आई वांटेड टू जस्ट फ्लैग कि इफ यू वॉच मुनीर्स स्पीच, एम्बेसडर मुनीर स्पीच, and you hear him talk about proximate cause and the original sin, he's framing it in the context of international law as a mechanism to disarm the criticism from the other side. कि वो कह रहे हैं कि भाई प्रॉक्सिमेट कॉज का एक कानून होता है दुनिया में और एक ओरिजिनल ड्राइविंग कॉज, अंडरलाइंग कॉज, ओरिजिनल सिन का कॉन्टेक्स्ट होता है, तो हम दोनों को इग्नोर नहीं कर सकते। ऑब्वियसली प्रॉक्सिमेट कॉज हमास के टेरर अटैक्स हैं विच आर कंडेमनेबल, लेकिन आपने पीछे जाना होगा और देखना होगा कि किस कंडीशंस के अंदर ये सारी चीज पैदा हुई, जो कि यूएन के सेक्रेटरी जनरल ने भी कहा डिड नॉट हैपन इन अ वैक्यूम। और भी लोग कह रहे हैं, ऑब्वियसली द इजरायली और प्रो इजरायली वॉइसेस अटैक एनीबॉडी हु डेयर्स provides that context, but I think Ambassador Munir did a fantastic job in covering that point.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I thought he was articulated really well. But I think one of the interesting countries that voted against the ceasefire, and I thought that was a huge irony, was Ukraine, because it seems to me that Ukraine benefits from the attention that the Russia-Ukraine war has gotten. And perhaps this attention does not serve Ukraine
so
well.
Just a quick correction, Amber. They abstained. They did not vote.
Abstained.
Against.
Sorry. Again, thank you. I when I keh diya ki they voted against, I assumed it. Yes, they abstained. But I think abstention is also equally not taking a position when, as a country that's also has been arguing and rightly arguing that it has been under attack from a bigger power. Humanitarian assistance is due to the people of Gaza. जहां आपको एक collective punishment के तौर पर आपको disproportionate response मिल रहा है, where hospitals and refugee camps are being bombed, and you can see how obviously the disinformation war has been massive, and I think it sometimes centers on questions of, well, for instance, जो hospital पर जो हमला हुआ था, the Christian hospital, who was initiated it. So you had open source investigations on किसकी थी, किसका rocket था, and that takes away from the broader picture with which Munir Akram was talking about actually. So let's step back for a minute. इस वक्त हम देख सकते हैं कि ज़्यादा फ़लस्तीनी बच्चे जो हैं वो मारे गए हैं. Let's step back for a bit. That this is even further back and say, well, Israel has been controlling Gaza's water and electricity and food and medicines. I think at the moment during this particular attack on Gaza and the offensive from Israel, I think they're meeting about 3% of their medical needs. इस वक्त अस्पतालों में anesthesia short है, जो thousands of people who are injured in this attack in Gaza, the doctors have actually had to perform operations and surgeries without anesthetic. Think about this. Is this proportionate? And you step back, and then there is the Nakba, and there is the occupation. So yes, the Israeli hostages need to be released. But I think what's really emerged is how conflicted we seem to be based on our interests and position, our ideologies and affiliations. And I was hoping कि इस वक्त जो आपने जो interview भी किया था, and I would like to sort of get your take on it as well, because I think it's obviously I'm in Quetta, for instance, यहाँ JUI-F के बड़े-बड़े billboards हैं कि किस तरह से फ़लस्तीन के हवाले से उन्होंने 29th आज के दिन ही मेरे ख्याल में sorry कल के दिन Saturday को I missed it before I came here, but you know like marches हो रहे हैं, conferences हो रही हैं, बातचीत हो रही है. It's easy to sympathize with who we perceive as a victim here. But I'm thinking that it isn't that easy for you.
Yeah, so Amar, I'll get to my view in just a moment, but before that, let's cut to Akbar Shahid Ahmed's interview. For those who don't know, मैंने उनकी articles के links भी description में डाल दिए हैं. They're must read. Akbar is senior foreign affairs reporter for Huffington Post, based here in DC. He's a fantastic journalist. And what Akbar's done, I think, over the last couple of weeks is कि उनकी जो स्टोरीज हैं वो हाईलाइट कर रही हैं वॉशिंगटन के अंदर, स्टेट डिपार्टमेंट के अंदर, व्हाइट हाउस के अंदर जो कॉन्फ्लिक्ट चल रहा है इस वक्त इन टर्म्स ऑफ यूएस और उसकी पॉलिसी के ऊपर. तो मैंने अकबर से बात की कि व्हाट इज ही हियरिंग, क्या उनको ऑब्वियसली फ्रॉम हिज सोर्सेज दैट ही हैज नॉट रिवील्ड what the conversation has been like, both in terms of evacuating American Palestinians from Gaza, but also on things like State Department को initially उनके staff को orders गए थे कि आपने ceasefire का लफ्ज इस्तेमाल नहीं करना वगैरह वगैरह. तो पहले interview सुनते हैं and then we'll cut back to what I'm seeing in Washington as well. Akbar, thank you for taking out the time, and thank you for the wonderful reporting you've been doing at the Huffington Post on this evolving and tragic story in terms of the conflict in the Middle East. But I would love, first of all, to hear your thoughts on what's going on domestically in the domestic political environment in the United States. Of course, there has been coverage, as you've written about, and now others are also writing about, that the Biden administration is engaging with the Muslim American community. And there have been, off-record conversations to hear what they have to say and also to share the Biden administration's point of view on their position. For example, on President Biden saying, in my view, at least disgracefully, that the death toll is questionable on the Palestinian side. So help the audience understand what you're hearing and following in terms of the domestic political implications of this conflict.
Sure. Thanks for having me. First off, Uzair, great effort, long-term listener. I'll say about the political implications. One thing I think gets really overlooked is this is not just understood as like a Muslim American issue, right? And Muslim Americans comprise maybe 2% of the voting base in the US. But there's a huge ripple effect here, right? Across like broader people of color communities, right? Whether it's the Black community, the Latino community, even the Asian American community, and then also just broadly young people. So I would say the political implications that a lot of people I'm talking to inside the White House on campaigns, political campaigns too, right? Are thinking about this as not just the 2% who are Muslims, but really like we need a message because we are clearly flailing. They've woken up, I'd say, in the last week or so to the fact that they're flailing. And they've done these off-record calls. They've done that some, as I've revealed, they've done some internally with Muslim American appointees, which is also really important, right? Because often the people they've brought in as political appointees are kind of these informal conduits to really important organizations or influencers or analysts. It's not enough, it's certainly not enough is what I'm hearing. Issues like what the president said about not believing the death toll, there's just really no coming back from that, right? Because the way I've heard this described from people inside the administration and outside is what it reveals is a sense of dehumanizing Muslims, right? Essentially saying, I don't believe them as they are being bombed. And what I've heard people say is like, look, you can say, by all means say, Hamas is an autocratic organization that controls this strip of land where people have not had the ability to vote or choose different leaders for almost 20 years now. And they do have a lot of influence over the ministry, right? Undeniable. You can say there's a reason to have caution with the numbers, but my heart goes out to the children. My heart goes out to the families. Instead to say, and twice, as he said in those remarks, not just once, but twice, to say off the cuff, the Palestinians are lying about what's happening to them, that's a really hard sell. So what I'm hearing right now is a lot of concern particularly in some key states, right? So Michigan always comes to mind as a place where there is a big Muslim American vote. But then we're thinking about places like, a campaign operative yesterday was talking to me about Georgia, right, where Biden only won in 2020 by 11,000 votes. That's a really tiny proportion. And a lot of the votes that helped him win came from people of color. Now, what the pushback that some Biden supporters in the community will give when you really push them, right, and you say, look, it's not enough to just say we hear you. It's not enough to just say we're against Islamophobia when that's not translating to policy, right? People want to see an actual change in response to that to some extent. What they ultimately will land on is, well, Donald Trump, the Republican frontrunner, is out here proposing another Muslim ban, right? And I think what's really striking about that is no one is saying that people are going to be running in droves to vote for Donald Trump, but if people stay home, that has an impact. And I'd invite folks trying to understand this to look at the comparison between Biden 2020 and Hillary 2016. Hillary Clinton obviously losing to Donald Trump because her main campaign argument kept being Donald Trump is a bad dude. And that wasn't enough for Hillary to win, right? Joe Biden came in on a thing of, I will rebuild America. Here are the values. Here are the communities I represent. Here's what I'll do. And he won, right? So there may be unlearning some lessons that they learned previously.
Yeah, and I've heard this argument as well that the alternative is worse. And I'm always like, it's disrespectful in my view to say that. To say, oh, you have nowhere else to go, so you're stuck with us. And I'm like, I don't know if I take that argument. And two, people will stay home. They may not vote for Donald Trump, but as you said, they will stay home. And I mean, this was also one of those things, like it's this disdain, right, in the way this response comes. Or even, for example, after the hate crime, where a Palestinian American child was murdered, they sent a token Muslim man to grieve with the community. And my question to a lot of Democrats that I know in the administration or adjacent to the administration is, would you do this to other communities? Would you send a token, insert your community man to mourn with that community? No, you don't do that. Very senior people from the administration go. And so why is it that the deputy administrator of the SBA, the Small Business Association, great guy, nothing against Dilawar, amazing, accomplished guy, but really, is that how you deal with a community in mourning at this moment in tragedy is something that struck a nerve in my mind as well. Another story you've done among many is sort of on the internal divide in the administration, particularly with the State Department, first starting with the position given to them saying, don't talk about a ceasefire, etc. Help the audience now understand the state of play within the administration, particularly in the institutional makeup, where many, according to your reporting and other reporting as well, have basically said the Biden administration and the White House is not listening to others who have other advice to offer in this moment of crisis.
Sure. On the hate crime, I think I'll just build on that for a second, because that was really telling in terms of maybe the president, if he had gotten the right advice, would have called that family right away. And he didn't. It took him days and days. And the way people are understanding this is the very small group around him, right? So right now he's talking to, useful to understand who's in the administration, also to understand why there's dissent within the administration. He has kind of his national security clique. They sort of call themselves the National Security Boys. Jake Sullivan, the National Security...
Which is not diverse, very diverse to begin with.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's a group of 4 men, white men, right? Sean Feiner, Jake Sullivan, Tony Blinken, and Brett McGurk, right? And then sort of people around them, Tom Sullivan, too, Jake's brother. But that group of people is thinking about national security in this very traditional way, right? US ally Israel, we will do everything. Hamas, Iran, this is like oppose, right? And where the place where their dissent is coming inside the administration is, you brought us in, right? This is a historically diverse administration. They have truly brought in, at all levels, people who have amazing resumes, amazing insights, but never had the opportunity to serve before. They've been brought in, and then they're not being listened to, right? And so what people are saying at the State Department, to some extent at the White House, at the National Security Council, and across government, right? Because there's a range of agencies that touch on foreign policy, right? There's aid, there's treasury, so many. what people are saying is we were brought in, and on this issue, it is such a tiny, tight circle of people who are being heard. The administration says, we're doing listening sessions and, come to this Muslim Association event at the State Department. And what I'm hearing from my sources at those listening sessions is people are not satisfied, right? It's not enough to say to people, please air your grievances. And when they press you to say, we can't tell you what's happening, but a lot is happening. So my reporting has looked at how that dissent has built up. One source described it to me as a mutiny brewing inside the State Department. There's something at the State Department called a dissent channel, which is a really unique mechanism. It allows State Department officials to tell the Secretary of State directly in a really powerful way, we disagree with this policy. It's going to come back to bite America. It's something that was used during the Vietnam War. It was used with the U.S. response to the Pakistani Civil War of 1971. It was used with the Afghanistan withdrawal. So I reported, I was the first to report that a cable was being prepared to go up the dissent channel. I've now learned there are multiple cables, multiple lines of effort that people at the State Department, not just in Washington, but all over the world, right? One of the officials I talked to said is, they are out here meeting with counterparts from Arab governments or Muslim governments, and they're being told, you are losing us for a generation. We can't be associated with you, right? If you are allowing a policy of collective punishment to go through. I'll close by talking about resignations, because I think that's a really important part of this. There was a story I broke last week about a really veteran, really respected official overseeing arms deals who resigned, right? So I called him as soon as I learned this was in the works, and I was like, what's happening? And he said, look, I have overseen the arms sales to Saudi Arabia as it's bombed Yemen, right? I've overseen so many surreal weapons deals, and I felt at least we have a substantive debate. Maybe we can put some limitations. And he said on this issue, there is no budging. And that's where there's so much dissent and so much tumult right now is it's not enough to let people just vent.
Yeah, and I would, if I were in that position, I would say this is you attempting in a policy of appeasement, which is even, more angering in that moment, because you're basically saying, I'm here to listen to you. Oh, calm down, you people, and we'll go about doing our job the way we intend, right? It's even more angering at that point.
Yeah, and I think that's also the sense of what are we here for, right? Are we here to just be poster children for you to tick a box? And so that's why I do think you could see more resignations. I think there are people at really high levels who are shocked. This is truly the strongest crisis I've seen. I've covered the State Department for a decade. It's the worst situation that I've seen in the Biden administration for sure, and it compares to some of the turmoil that there was during the Trump era.
Yeah, I remember, and you would obviously remember this, at the time of the exit from Kabul. It was a painful moment because there were similar dynamics at play where many of us on the outside, I'm not even in the administration, were looking at what was happening in Kabul and saying, White House and state do not have their act together. There are dozens and dozens of families who have served with our soldiers at risk, and we're failing them. And there was basically days went by and nothing really happened in terms of what was going on in Washington. And there was no accountability. Nobody resigned. Nobody was fired. Everything went back to the way it was. And it made me ask the question at that point in time that we remember, from the Trump years, that Donald Trump was a loyalist president. And maybe it didn't get reported enough that Joe Biden is also a loyalist president, because there was no accountability of such a big disaster in Afghanistan at the time of the U.S. exit. So this is magnitudes worse. I agree with you. Last question before I let you go. Obviously, this is a very fluid situation. There are political dynamics at play. As you said, there's broader dynamics, right? Young voters, people of color, etc. Left-wing Jewish voices also as allies, protesting, locking down Grand Central. Where do you see this going, let's say in the 7-10-day cycle with more polling data in the works and all of that? What are some things you will be keeping an eye out on? And what would you like the audience to also pay attention to as this situation evolves?
I love that you brought up the Kabul translator parallel, because there is a really strong parallel there right now, which is the up to 600 Americans trapped inside Gaza. right? Which there's a US government responsibility. These are their citizens. Not to mention beyond that, like green card holders, then there are family members. If you add all that up, maybe it approaches like
And they don't get special chartered flights to get them out.
Right. And there's not an airport in Gaza. You can't do a flight, but Gaza is blockaded by Israel. You could funnel people out into Israel. That Israel is in no mood to let that happen. So I don't think that's a realistic thing to expect. But what I will be tracking very closely is, will there be some kind of effort to at least get people out through Egypt? Because it is surreal for people. And I'm talking to Americans trapped in Gaza, who are sending, when they can, when they do have internet, when they do have power on their phones, they're sending images, they're sending recordings of like bombs 600 feet from where they are, right? They're saying, we're sleeping with our child with us, so if we die together. Those stories.
And really quickly to interrupt, because your reporting also talked about this as well, getting conflicting messages from the State Department, of all things in this moment of crisis, conflicting messages.
Right. While bombs are landing, saying, go to the crossing, which has been bombed 4 times, right? Saying, go to the crossing, wait, it'll open. So I will track the crossing. I think on that particular issue, there's so much internal frustration because it's a legal obligation of the US government. I'll be tracking if they have a solution on that. And if they don't, that will be, that gets to the dehumanization point we talked about earlier, right? Because it really sends a signal of Palestinian American lives are considered, a second-class version of American. And that's something that any person of color...
Which reinforces, again, to interrupt, the situation with Shireen's case, right? An American journalist was killed by the Israelis. First, they said, we didn't do it, the Palestinians did. Then weeks later turned out, no, in fact, it was the Israelis that did that. And this is an American journalist. And I don't think any significant impact was there on the relationship with Israel or US pushback, DC's pushback, the Biden administration's pushback to the Israelis in a way. Let's say if an American citizen journalist, for example, died in Yemen at the hands of Saudi soldiers, let's say, it would be a very different situation.
Yeah, I think that's a good parallel. So I would track that. I think that's going to be really telling. I think, and maybe they'll figure out something with Egypt and Rafah. I would really track that. I'm also tracking how much the administration talks about, because again, this is about policy. It's not just about people being heard. How much they are transparent about their view of what looks like Israeli preparation for mass displacement into Egypt. Because that's a nightmare scenario for Palestinians. That is sort of really raises the question of, is this ethnic cleansing, right? That would be a really clear violation of international humanitarian law. But there are a lot of indications coming out of Israel, commentators, but also some government documents of their plan being home demolitions in Gaza. So people in Gaza can't go back to northern Gaza. Israel has already told them to go to the south. And then to push them into the Sinai and sort of create a permanent refugee situation there. If the administration turns a blind eye to that, pretends it's not happening, or even tacitly endorses it, that's really striking. Or maybe they push back, but right now I haven't seen much pushback on that front. And finally, I'd be tracking, this question of how much humanitarian aid gets into Gaza. It's been a tiny fraction of what's needed, and fuel, importantly, which is like the critical thing, has not been going in. Those are the 3. I'd also track the ceasefire thing, to be very honest. Maybe this is the DC cynic in me. I cannot, at this juncture, imagine President Biden calling for a ceasefire. I know a lot of people are calling for that. I could see Tony Blinken did talk about a humanitarian pause. I could see something, again, as you're saying, with poll numbers and increasing public pressure about them pushing for that. But just to use the word ceasefire, I can't imagine. So that's a 4.
Thank you for that. One last quick follow-up on that, because, of course, over the last 24 hours, we've seen more and more visuals of settler violence against Palestinians in the West Bank. The NSA today, I believe on Jake Tapper's show, said that this is unacceptable. Is that a conversation that is brewing in the White House? And I ask this question because it's been a question in my mind. Is, rightfully so, after the Hamas terror attacks, the US administration's view was Israel has a right to self-defense. My question is, at what point in time, if ever, American policymakers will say the Palestinians also have a right to self-defense, when radical settlers backed by the IDF in the West Bank kill Palestinians, evict them from their villages, or even when Israeli jets bomb places like Jenin in the West Bank, where there isn't a Hamas ruling. Hamas is not ruling there. So is the evolving situation in the West Bank something you're following, and what are you seeing over there as well?
Yeah. I'll begin my response by just, I reported from Israel and Gaza and the West Bank. I was the first Pakistani to get a press credential to go there, and it was really illuminating, right? I think you really, unless you're there, you can't imagine it. The West Bank is one of the most surreal places I've ever been, because it is so easy to be a settler or an Israeli in the West Bank, and the hurdles on what's supposed to be a Palestinian-ruled region, the hurdles on just being a Palestinian and existing are unimaginable, right? Even in a place which, as you say, is not ruled by Hamas, is not a site of active conflict. So I'd encourage folks to maybe read my piece on that, just for a little visual of what it's like, life there. The West Bank conversation also gets to understanding the Biden admin's record on this whole file long before this current uptick, right? So settler violence, which you mentioned, the US has always condemned. Republicans, Democrats, it's been, really seen as a huge problem. The Biden administration has not done a single thing, even before October 7th, to stop it, to tell Israel to do something about it. They've condemned it, they've said it's not okay, but particularly within their own party, from liberal Jews, often like Jewish lawmakers, right, who see settler actions in the West Bank as undermining Israel's own long-term security. So often they're hearing that from their own constituencies. This administration has chosen not to ever really do anything about it. I could see them once Ambassador Jack Lewis confirmed and gets out there, right, which is quickly happening in the Senate. If he's out there, I could see him prioritizing that as an issue. But again, unfortunately, Israel itself is in the grips of such a sense of understandable remorse, but also desire for retribution, that the US will not want to look like it's pressuring Israelis. But I think it's on a lot of people's minds. It's on officials' minds, certainly, and it'll be a top priority for Ambassador Liu.
Thank you so much, Akbar. Keep up the great work. Thanks for sharing your insights. And for the audience, link in the description can take you to all of Akbar's amazing stories. Keep up the great work and keep informing us about what's happening within the administration and the political and institutional repercussions of the administration's policy. Thank you.
Thanks.
तो हमने आर्टिकल अकबर की बातें सुनी, उनकी आर्टिकल्स पढ़ें, ज़बरदस्त रिपोर्टिंग करें, उनको सोशल मीडिया पे फॉलो करें. Amber, I think the broad thrust, and I saw Akbar last week as well in person, वो ये है कि within the administration, within the American political system or institutions, right, हम पहले भी मैं describe कर चुका हूँ, I think in the Khan context, के 3 बड़े पिलर्स हैं अमेरिकन फॉरेन पॉलिसी के, या 4: स्टेट डिपार्टमेंट, डिफेंस डिपार्टमेंट, कैपिटल हिल एंड द व्हाइट हाउस. White House is feeling increasingly pressured from Muslim American communities. तो सदर जो बाइडेन ने कोई 5 या 6 मुस्लिम लीडर से अभी 1-2 दिन पहले मुलाकात भी की, उस पर रिपोर्टिंग भी हुई, उनको पुश बैक आ रहा है सियासी तौर पे. State Department के अंदर.
Can I just intervene here as well, because I think Joe Biden, for instance, tweeted about those beheaded Israeli children. And हम अपने leaders पे बहुत तनकीद करते हैं कि वो गलत खबरें इस तरह से शेयर करते हैं, becoming part of that disinformation landscape as well. And your president has been very guilty of that.
Yes, and the administration and tried to walk that back, but the damage was done. But even more so, I think उससे ज़्यादा जिस पे उनको pushback आया है, and rightfully so, वो ये है कि जब उन्होंने सवाल उठाया कि कितने फलस्तीनी मारे गए, उन्होंने कहा मैं यकीन नहीं करता इन नंबर्स के ऊपर. तो वो it set off a firestorm.
I've been seeing a lot of that from the US. Well, this is from Hamas. This is from this. Well, okay, believe the 8 agencies that you're cutting off funding to, for instance, or not. Another example, and that really makes me angry, for instance, is Elon Musk's Starlink in satellite communications. He is not providing access to 8 agencies to help people through the Starlink satellite.
Well, he decided to do that, और इजरायलियों ने कहा कि हम उसको कट ऑफ कर देंगे, हम परमिशन नहीं देते. तो ये जो बाइडेन के ऊपर प्रेशर है, इट्स रियल, ही इज फीलिंग इट, द पोल नंबर्स आर बिगिनिंग टू रिफ्लेक्ट इट, और अकबर की जो रिपोर्टिंग है एज ही शेयर्ड कि ये अंदर में भी प्रेशर बिल्ड हो रहा है इन द इंस्टीट्यूशनल मेकअप ऑफ द यूनाइटेड स्टेट्स। स्टेट डिपार्टमेंट में भी एक डिसेंट है। Obviously, leadership has had to then hold town halls or listening sessions, or however they want to label it, to understand people's point of view, calm the rhetoric down. लेकिन जो इस वक्त सियासी अंबर कम्युनिटीज के अंदर जो एंगर बबल अप हो रहा है, this will be something worth watching as the 2024 election plays out. And I'll give you my own example in terms of that. I campaigned for Joe Biden in the 2020 election, along with many people like me, because we did not want another 4 years of Donald Trump because of his Islamophobia, because of chaos, all corruption, all of that stuff. But many of us, and I've been having a lot of conversations, will not vote under the current circumstances for Joe Biden. We will not campaign for Joe Biden. And that's a shared sentiment among the 40 or below crowd, I would say, that I am in frequent touch with. And many of us are angry, are heartbroken, are disgusted by the dehumanizing positions that President Biden and his White House has taken. And I think that is a shared sentiment among the Muslim American community. And there is pushback coming very, very significantly on the administration. And the poll numbers are beginning to reflect that, and local political reporting is beginning to reflect that. Now, I think इसका एक इम्पैक्ट जो एक और हुआ है इस पूरे 2 हफ्तों का, वो ये हुआ है कि पोस्ट 9/11, एंड अगेन मेरा अपना एक्सपीरियंस है कि मैं 2007 में अमेरिका फॉर कॉलेज पढ़ने के लिए आया। तो मेरे से जो 2 या 1 जनरेशन आगे के जो लोग हैं, दे हैव ऑब्वियसली मच मोर विविड मेमोरीज अबाउट द पोस्ट 9/11 अमेरिका, वेयर जहां आपको हमेशा सवाल किया जाता था कि पहले आप कंडेम करें XYZ टेररिस्ट ग्रुप को, फिर आगे बात होगी। वो रिटर्न हुआ है आफ्टर द हमास टेरर अटैक्स। और मैं एक पर्सनल एग्जांपल देता हूं। मैंने सोशल मीडिया पे लिखा कि वी एज अगेन आई हैव बीन रीडिंग मौलाना आजाद एंड आई हैव बीन रिफ्लेक्टिंग ऑन इंडियाज ओन द सबकॉन्टिनेंट्स ओन फ्रीडम स्ट्रगल फ्रॉम ब्रिटिश कॉलोनियल ऑक्यूपेशन। तो उसके कॉन्टेक्स्ट में मैंने लिखा कि वी डिसेंड फ्रॉम अ जनरेशन, द ग्रेट जनरेशन ऑफ सबकॉन्टिनेंट लीडर्स, इंक्लूडिंग गांधी, नेहरू, अंबेडकर, पटेल, बोस, जिन्ना, इकबाल, ऑल ऑफ दीज पीपल, मौलाना आजाद, जिन्होंने, और खवातीन भी इसमें थी, इनको हम भूल जाते हैं ऑब्वियसली, देयर वर लॉट ऑफ ग्रेट, एक थी उन्होंने, जस्ट अ क्विक सेगवे, मौलाना आजाद लिखते हैं उसमें, हर नेम वाज मिसेस असफ अली, और उन्होंने लीड की थी रेजिस्टेंस कैंपेन टू द एक्सटेंट व्हेन दे वर ऑल इन प्रिजन इन द अर्ली 40s, टू द एक्सटेंट दैट द ब्रिटिश वाइसरॉय रिमेंबर्ड हर टू द फाइनल डेज के ये खातून हमारे हाथ नहीं लगी, इन्होंने जो है वो बड़ा हमें जो है वो
But history
भगाया।
doesn't remember her actual name or her maiden
करेक्ट,
name.
मिसेज आसफ अली से उनको मौलाना आजाद
Mrs.
भी,
Asif
आई
Ali.
नीड टू लुक इनटू हर कि वो कौन थी। तो they were, so I put a social media post in that context कि हम descendants हैं उन लोगों के जिन्होंने colonial occupation को resist किया, और global south की तारीख भरी पड़ी है इससे, और जो आज़ादी है और जो justice है, इंसाफ है, वो आज नहीं तो कल नहीं तो परसों होगा, against and freedom will prevail over occupation. तो उस पे कुछ ऐसे obviously I ignore social media, you don't read and take things too seriously, but some of my own people, friends I know, began asking कि what do you mean by freedom and justice, as if I have to explain my definition of freedom because I'm seen differently, right? That has been a recognition in this context कि मैं अमेरिकन सिटीजन हूँ, लेकिन मैं पाकिस्तानी अमेरिकन हूँ, मैं मुसलमान भी हूँ, मे बी कल्चरली, मे बी इन प्रैक्टिस, दैट्स नन ऑफ एनीबडीज बिजनेस, बट दैट्स माय आइडेंटिटी एंड दैट्स हाउ आई एम सीन. बट टू आस्क मी टू define how I see freedom and justice, right? I'm not taking that anymore, and I will snap back at you because you would not ask somebody else, perhaps a Caucasian person, the same question for them to define how they see freedom and liberty and justice.
It's the same. I mean, it's the same thing as blood. It runs the same in every human being.
Yeah,
Everybody wants the
so
same
that
freedom,
othering
right?
has come front and center in this current, and it's been very difficult, and there's a generational divide. So this is my last point on this. People and friends and others that I've spoken to in Washington primarily, those that began their career in the very early years of the post 9/11 era, again, we must remember कि उस वक्त just diversity across the board इतनी नहीं थी अमरीकी सियासी निज़ाम के अंदर. So to be rising in that political system, let's say of Washington DC, a lot of my friends who are senior to me had to keep their head down and keep doing the work day in, day out and not snap back. Right? Because you this is
sounds like it sounds like exactly the first generation,
Correct.
the first gen immigrant experience, right?
Yeah. तो उन लोगों से जब अब मैं बात करता हूँ तो वो अभी भी कहते हैं कि यार अपना सर नीचे रखो, don't get into arguments too much क्योंकि this is how we progress and we need to sort of continue chugging along and continue to sort of be part of the conversation but not rock the boat too much. लेकिन जो 40 और below या 35 और below का crowd है, let's say out of undergrad or grad school plus 1 or 2 sort of levels up in the system, right? The younger crowd, people like Akbar, for example, or Sabrina and others, they're not taking this for an answer. They're pushing back very aggressively. And that's where Akbar's reporting comes out of, is that कि ये जो pushback हमें नजर आ रहा है, 10 साल पहले ये pushback आपको अमरीकी निज़ाम में नजर नहीं आता. अब थोड़ा ऑर्गेनाइजेशन हो गया है, थोड़ी कैपेसिटी बिल्ड हो गई है, थोड़े इंस्टीट्यूशंस में प्रेजेंस हो गई है, तो आपको पुशबैक नजर आता है. It's still very difficult to have that conversation with people for very legitimate reasons, I might add, because there are still American hostages by Hamas that need to be returned. So in that context, adding a lot of layers of context is a very challenging conversation, but that pushback is happening and we're beginning to see, I would say, a shift in the way, even within the Democratic Party, things will evolve on the Israel-Palestine conflict, primarily because of this pushback that we're seeing and Akbar's reporting is highlighting.
That's really fascinating. And I think just to speak to the conflict, I think people feel, it's also worthwhile exploring what the Israeli left feels like. Obviously, if you follow Haaretz, unki reporting, unki commentary, it's really important in these times. I was just listening to an Ezra Klein podcast as well on the Israeli left, and we have to sort of understand. Let's also try and understand their point of view as well. Why this dream of a peace in the Middle East, the settlement of this question, what their hopes are, what the strategies are, what their conflicts are. I think it's important to understand that too. So
yeah. And they locked down Grand Central Station on Friday, और वहाँ arrest भी हुए और हजारों की तादाद में लोगों ने station को बंद कर दिया.
Yeah, so I mean, there's been some big Western capitals, maybe huge protests. You saw perhaps जब इराक के साथ जंग मुसल्लत की थी जो अमेरिका ने.
And I think last point before we go to winners and losers, I think ये हमने पिछले हफ्ते भी कहा था, I would say this again to our primarily जो हमारी पाकिस्तानी audience है कि we all have a shared humanity. और अगर आप इंसान को इंसान की तरह देख के conversation करें, चाहे वो social media पर हो या private में हो, so it makes for a much more engaging conversation. I think broadly labeling somebody because of their views that you may not like or disagree with is not going to lead to anything optimal happening over here. And I think for me, that's been the biggest takeaway is like, can I have those conversations with people I know, people I trust, people I talk to on an almost daily basis, and we don't see eye to eye, and that's okay, but we can engage in a conversation and understand each other. And I think Shadi Hamid did a similar conversation. I'll try to find the link to it. I haven't listened to it yet. उन्होंने अपने दोस्त के साथ की है जो कि खुद एक Zionist हैं. उनका व्यू इसराइल के ऊपर बड़ा डिफरेंट है compared to Shadi's view, और वो conversation podcast में करते हैं. I haven't listened to it, but I want to, because I want to see how two friends who are polar opposite ends of the spectrum on something like this, how do they engage in dialogue?
Yeah, I think that it is important to keep listening. I mean, I obviously personally will say sympathy for the oppressed and disproportionate responses and collective punishment. These are all trigger words. But I think it's also important to understand the other point of view as well. I feel like it's important anyway. And it helps you sort of think through how you respond to that, their perspective as well, right? By understanding it.
Correct. You got to know your audience to convince them about your point of view. That's comms 101.
And I just want to say kudos and hats off to all the Palestinians, commentators, journalists who've lost people, who are afraid of losing people, who've been on the media talking so rationally about all of this, whereas we get emotional. I just it's something that we need to learn from.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll keep covering that. Again, check out Akbar's journalism, check out his social media, listen to Shadi's conversation. But we will move on to winners and losers. I will start first, Amber, because I know you don't have any winners. मेरा एक ही winner है, मैंने
नहीं,
jersey
मैंने अब
पहनी हुई है.
सोच लिए हैं.
सोच लिया है.
During the course of this conversation, you have opened my mind, Uzair, and I
Okay.
have a couple of winners too. And I'll very quickly run through them, but you go
Go
first.
for it. I will go first. My winner is Arsenal, big 5-0 win. Eddie Nketiah, rising star, gets a hat trick. So a good weekend for Team Arsenal, for the Gunners. But the loser is Team Pakistan and the boys in green, जिन्होंने मतलब ऐसा क्रिकेट खेला है कि मैं तो सोच रहा हूँ कि क्लब लेवल क्रिकेट मैंने थोड़ा सा खेला हुआ है. हमने इतना बुरा क्रिकेट क्लब लेवल पे भी नहीं खेला कभी, शायद इतनी बुरी कैप्टनसी नहीं देखी होगी क्लब लेवल पे. बट यस, अभी भी कुछ लोग उम्मीद लगाए बैठे हैं कि हम सारे जीत जाएं और कुछ और हो जाए तो शायद सेमीफाइनल बनता है. मैंने कहा भाईजान आप और भाई बहनों
यार ये
भाइयों,
I'm sorry, but I'm going to say it again. 92 का जो हमारा experience है, it has ruined us forever. It does not always happen. It will not always happen. The stars will not align. Please let go of it.
एग्जैक्टली.
And I have to say, it's probably ये जो पाकिस्तान की जो losses हैं, it's ruined a lot of household peace, peace in the household for many of us, including me, where my husband has been in a very bad mood after every match.
और आपके दिमाग में शायद वसीम अकरम, शोएब मलिक, फखरे आलम और क्या कहते हैं मिसबाउल हक और मोइन खान की आवाज जो है वो गूंज रही होगी हर दफा ऑन द पवेलियन शो, जो कि हर कोई देख रहा होता है. बट यस, आई हैव लॉस्ट होप.
I suppose he's taking revenge for all the times I've listened to all my news and current affairs shows.
Exactly. So I have lost hope. I am not expecting the unexpected or a miracle in India that helps Pakistan qualify. So Team Pakistan is the loser and the PCB is the loser for me. So over to you.
Okay, all right. So I think in terms of winner, I would say the military-industrial complex has obviously been a winner in the last year or so. And there's been lots of great reporting on Reuters as well. कि किस तरह से defense contractors, I suppose, including Pakistan, have benefited from the war in Russia and Ukraine. And you can also see now with Israel and Palestine. So I think sarcastically, they're the winners for me of this week. They've clearly been benefiting.
मेरी मेमन जो वो है ना दूर दूर से मेमन फीलिंग वाइब्स वो आपको इम्पैक्ट कर रही है अंबर, कि आप भी धंधे का आप सोचने लग गई हैं कि देखें इसमें भी जो है वो विनर, फाइनेंशियल विनर हैं इसके अंदर.
Yeah, but I don't mean in a happy, great sense. So congratulations. It's yeah. I think you reminded me, yes, that I think Master Munir Akram, जिस पे हम बहुत बातों पे तनकीद भी करते रहते हैं, but for leading the way for the speech in the UN, which may not seem to be a lot. We have to remember that the UN itself has been pretty powerless in major conflicts for many years now, but still, I think he showed leadership and articulated the case really well. So he's my winner of the week. And I guess my loser was going to be the Pakistan team. हाँ, लेकिन my loser was going to be the Pakistan team. I must confess कि मेरा दिल नहीं था कि मैं देख सकूं. And I still don't understand why, even until yesterday, people were still expressing some kind of hope. So, they're my losers as well. So I share that with you.
ये जो नशा है ना अंबर, मिरेकल्स का, क्रिकेट और मिरेकल्स का, ये नशा नहीं उतरता इतनी आसानी से. And I think Ambassador Munir is a good winner selection from you. Badi, we often, rightfully so, as you said, criticize Pakistan's foreign policy, its institutions, its leadership, what they say, don't say. But he showed good skill at the UN, and for what it's worth, we should applaud them when it's due.
My loser of the week, obviously, क्योंकि it's the 29th, the Afghan refugees को expel करने की जो TikTok deadline हमने हर रोज अखबार में और टेलीविजन पे भी हमें नजर आ रही होती है, वो 31 अक्टूबर को खत्म हो जाएगी by most accounts. There have been some flights that have been leaving. I will share something very personal before we quickly close this out. Is that जब भी मैं क्योंकि मैं अब कराची से इस्लामाबाद काफी frequent travel होता है मेरा. I mean, I have to travel a lot for my job, but इस्लामाबाद के hotels में बहुत सारे very qualified Afghans who are stuck in a limbo, where the hotels were booked up in Islamabad. And I think unko finally nikala ja raha hai, apart from others who are obviously not so fortunate, who are hiding out, who've been hoping for asylum somewhere. The big question about whose responsibility is it, we have to remember that obviously Pakistan is not a signatory, speaking of the UN, the Refugee Convention, but that doesn't mean there shouldn't be humanity and empathy, and perhaps not demonize an entire group. क्योंकि यही हमें वजह जो बताई गई है कि दहशतगर्दी जराइम के वाक़यात में इजाफा हुआ है, इसकी वजह से अफगान को निकालना जरूरी है. गैर कानूनी तौर पर मुकीम है, ठीक है, but there is a fair process which you could have followed, and it isn't like this to demonize entire population. And you saw that reaction in cricket as well. जब Afghanistan beat Pakistan, and one of I forget the name of the cricketer, but he did actually say this victory is for all the Afghans that Pakistan is expelling. So imagine what you gain, whatever you're gaining. I'm sure we won't find out, but what you're definitely gaining is resentment.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Amber, and I think maybe next week we should try to have a journalist who's been reporting on this return of refugees and the human element in particular. Because again, जरूरी है, as you said, empathy रखना लोगों के लिए. वो भी इंसान हैं, पाकिस्तान में काफी ज़्यादा पैदा हुए after so many years, over so many years. तो एक
We
duty
never
है.
gave him citizenship.
Exactly.
We never, एक हमने failed attempts बार-बार किए हैं. Obviously something is not working.
Yeah. And I was talking to a friend of mine, I think जब ये announce हुआ था कि one of the few things where I actually genuinely support Imran Khan and rightfully support his stance was जब उन्होंने कोशिश की थी citizenship देने की announcement की थी. That was a very brave thing he attempted. He obviously failed, and there are reasons for why he failed. But just to have that empathy and acknowledge कि ये लोग एक तरह से पाकिस्तानी ही हैं क्योंकि यहाँ पले बड़े हैं, यहाँ पैदा हुए हैं. So we should also remember कि in some of these issues, Khan Saab had a good right sort of mind on about reform. He failed, but that's okay. Many people fail in good reforms, but at least he showed that empathy in that. So
I agree.
Props to him for
I agree.
that.
And think of the advantage of giving citizenship. आप उनको tax set मिला रहे हैं. So many do business. अभी ये चमन और बलूचिस्तान में, I'm in Quetta again, but चमन पर बहुत सारा एहतजाज भी हुआ था because वहाँ trade होता है. So again, think about the advantages and the bonuses of when you give people who've lived here for so long citizenship, and people who've had to run from their countries because of various reasons. और हम expect करते हैं कि हमारे जो शहरी जब वो गैर कानूनी तौर पर किसी और मुल्क भागने की कोशिश करें तो उनको भी एक warm welcome दी जाए, लेकिन हम खुद करने को भी तैयार हैं.
Yeah. So we'll cover that next week. In the meantime, hope you guys liked our show this week. And again, 2 हफ्ते in a row हमने time पे podcast किया है, so we will continue it next week as well. Until then, Khuda Hafiz, and do let us know other topics that we should cover.
Khuda Hafiz.